Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Alex DatePsych, a researcher in behavioural science with a particular interest in human relationships. We spoke about everything from age gaps to dad bods to cheating to how men and women experience jealousy differently, what men and women really desire in the opposite sex, assortative mating, everything. In the extended part of the episode, we spoke in particular about what men and women find physically attractive in the opposite sex. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where as always you can find the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the MMM chat community, and the whole back catalogue of extended episodes. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Alex, can we start by talking about divorce? Because there's this very widespread statistic that I've heard that something like 70% of divorces are initiated by women. And I know that you've dug into the data on this in terms of, what that actually means and also what it reveals about who is and is not more likely to opt out of marriages. Is it men or women?
Certainly, sure. So yeah, that's definitely a very common talking point. And I think people kind of stop there. They just say, women initiate 70% of divorces or 60% or 150% or whatever the case may be. It just goes up all the time, what they like to say. And it kind of stops there. And the implication, of course, with it stopping there is like women are at fault, like the man did nothing or whatever the case may be. But it really doesn't reveal that much. So across the research, we do see that women seem to initiate divorce a little bit more. I think the number across all of the research is probably closer to 60%. But in any case, this kind of occurs when you ask couples who initiated the divorce, that sort of a thing. When you dig a little bit deeper and you ask couples who have divorced, did you both want the divorce? Both of them seem to say yes. So there's actually pretty high agreement for divorcing couples as far as both individuals say, yeah, I was ready to leave the relationship, even if one was the first to ask for it or initiate it. And so then that still kind of leaves the question, why do women seem to ask for it first? And, a lot of that difference, because it's not that large, probably can just be explained by sex differences in behavior throughout the relationship. For example, we know that men are inclined to cheat more in relationships, and that's one of kind of the, top 10 reasons for divorce there. We also know that men are more likely to abuse substances. That's another big reason for divorce. So there's these sex differences in antisocial behavior that can contribute. Then I think on the flip side of that, we also know that female relationship satisfaction declines a little bit faster than it does for men, which, there's not a single good explanation for that. That could just be a sex difference in personality itself. It could be due to behavior of the other partner in the relationship. But yeah, there's a lot when you dig into it that says, okay, women initiate more, but there's probably good explanations for why that's the case.
I've always wondered if it might just be an artifact of the fact that maybe women are more likely to sort of do the paperwork in the family. I know that that's true in my household. I do, because of women being slightly more conscientious or something. But are you saying that actually if you ask in surveys, people are still, it still seems to be the case that women are slightly more likely to initiate? So it's not just who's actually filing for divorce, as the American phrase.
Right, exactly. In fact, most of the research looks at, it asks divorcing couples or individuals who have been divorced or couples they find to have been divorced and says who wanted it more, who asked for it first. So most of it's not actually based on filings. If you look at filings, you can actually find divorce rates are pretty similar. For example, the U.S. is a little bit different with filings because it's all county by county. There's not like a good single U.S. database. But when you look at European countries, take Spain, for example, a little more familiar with, you see that divorce filings are the same for men and women. And they also have women file, men file, and then there's a mutual filing option. And the mutual filing makes up about 60% of all divorces. Then it's split pretty equally between men and women. So if you look at who files, in cases where there is mutual filing, then you will see that that actually constitutes most divorces, which could also kind of indicate, if we're looking at filings, yeah, kind of consistent with the reports, there's typically agreement, that when someone's ready to divorce, the other person kind of is as well.
Interesting. Okay, so maybe what's going on is that, but what's hard to tell, right, and what is kind of at the basis of this red pill claim is who is damaging the marriage most aggressively, I guess, because it might be that the man has an affair and the woman says, this is the last straw, I'm over this, and she initiates the divorce. Or, there could be these... it seems very likely to me, and I know this isn't generally the feminist view either, that it takes two to tango and there's going to be some degree of mutual destruction going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, almost, I don't want to call it a law, but it's an extremely replicable observation, is assortative mating. People select partners who are similar to themselves, and this happens for antisocial behavior. So, for example, problem drinkers, much more likely to pair up with problem drinkers. Individuals that are abusive, much more likely to pair up with individuals who hit back. So there's things like this, that, yeah, it kind of takes two to tango. If someone is a problematic person in a relationship, there's a good chance that they've picked another person who's a problematic person. And I think we can see this in like who gets divorced as well, because it's not just randomly distributed. People talk about like 50% of relationships end in divorce, but it's like, okay, but if you look at people with PhDs, for example, it's like 10%, right? So divorce is not something that's just randomly distributed across the population. When you look at personality traits associated with certain demographics, then you're going to see, well, this demographic divorces a lot. This one doesn't very much. And that's kind of a big part of the picture as well.
Okay, spill the beans. So PhDs are less likely to get divorced. Which are the groups that are more likely to get divorced?
Men and women, yeah. So that's another interesting thing too. In the red pill, they talk about like I don't want to date a woman that's educated. I mean, if you want to avoid divorce, dating a woman who's educated is probably one of the best things you could do that have a very low rate of divorce.
That's so interesting because, of course, there's this whole school of very annoying the literature and journalism where women will write these kind of tell-all things about how they left their marriage because they weren't being fulfilled and so on, and it's kind of rage bait, and it tends to attract a lot of the red pill attention and indeed attention from everyone else. But in fact, those women, the highly educated segment of society, are extremely unlikely to be getting divorced.
Yeah, exactly. And that's interesting that you mentioned that. So they write this rage bait, and of course, the red pill seems very fueled by anecdotes and that sort of thing. But probably the women writing that sort of thing are themselves highly educated. So they're probably actually a part of a demographic that's much less likely to engage in infidelity, much less likely to divorce, much less likely to engage in those behaviors. So it's almost kind of like signaling behavior that's not that common of the demographic that they come from.
That's really interesting. Okay, so are people who are more likely to get divorced poorer, less educated? Are there any other predictors?
I think personality traits in general are a pretty good predictor. If you have individuals who score higher in antisocial personality metrics, if it's something like the dark triad, if they score lower in conscientiousness, I think agreeableness has a smaller relationship there. Neuroticism has a higher relationship divorce. So yeah, the big five as far as personality can predict it. There's a lot of smaller personality things that are less well known. Often they're related to sexual behavior. So something, for example, that's called sexual narcissism, which is like the tendency or willingness to kind of gratify your own sexual needs at the expense of others. Like that's really, really robustly predictive of infidelity and subsequently divorce in that case. So yeah, there's a lot of small behavioral personality things you can look at that's kind of like, and a lot of these things you probably will just recognize in people if you observe them closely.
Yeah, like difficult personalities, yeah. We'd say colloquially, yes. Meaning, yes, things like highly neurotic, not very conscientious and so on. And you're saying that those people are likely to be attracted to one another. So someone high in dark triad traits is likely to be attracted to someone else also high in dark triad traits?
Yeah, that's right. We see assortative mating for the dark triad. And, there's some research that indicates the dark triad is attractive generally, both for men and women. So women a little bit higher in the dark triad, more attractive, and men a little bit higher in the dark triad, more attractive. And that's primarily concentrated on the facet of narcissism, which might simply be because narcissists are very motivated to portray a good side of themselves. They can kind of replicate or mimic pro-social behavior, which we also know is is attracted, and they also take more care of their physical appearance. So those are things, so it might just even be related just to physical attractiveness in that case, like people who maintain their appearance a little bit better. But yeah, they're more likely to attract each other even more, and they're more likely to attract individuals who are low in that. So.
And to what extent do you think that, so obviously there's been this big decline in marriage rates over the last half century, a bit more, I suppose, now 60 years. And there are different interpretations of this, right? So the sort of one feminist interpretation is it's because of women suddenly having the freedom to leave abusive marriages. The conservative interpretation, it's because of the loss of religiosity and the loss of social guardrails and so on. And then there's the more sort of hereditarian position, I suppose, which is that, yeah, maybe these people who are now having failed non-marriages or like bad non-marriages, they would have got married previously. They also would have got divorced previously. It's not as though, do you see what I mean? That it's like there's always some portion of people who have difficult relationships, and they're probably those people are actually less likely to get married nowadays, and so they're not showing up in the marriage statistics, but they're still having the same kind of patterns.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, we're seeing a trend right now that kind of the youngest adults are waiting a little bit longer to form relationships, but past that point, about 24 or 25, relationship formation has not changed much, but marriage rates have gone down. So yeah, what's very likely is that people are just having relationships, they're cohabiting instead of getting married. When in the past, they would have gotten married more, perhaps more social incentive or pressure to get married, that kind of a thing. I suppose another potential explanation is the economics of it and all of that. You have individuals, again, that's probably related to delaying relationships. Individuals who, they're struggling financially, they can't leave their home, they feel like they can't support a family, or they're pursuing careers in the long term, because certainly the bar for career advancement has progressively increased. So people are now saying, okay, now I got to go back and do a master's. Now I got to go back to PhD. This is a small portion of the population, but it seems to be a common anecdote. Like, yeah, I have a girlfriend. I want to get married, but I'm waiting till I finish my PhD. And it's like, oh, okay, so you're postponing this another 4 years or something. Maybe anything can happen during that period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably, those like these possible explanations for why marriage rates have declined. I think there's probably some truth in all of them. For instance, the conservative interpretation that it's about the loss of sort of institutions. There is some evidence, I believe, that people will stay married for longer. They will stay together for longer if they are married, all else being equal. That there is something about the legal bond which people take seriously, and it does have a binding effect. But obviously, if divorce is easy.
Yeah, and yeah, that's the thing is there's this interdependence model of relationships, which is simply how do people leave relationships. So people have their standards for entering a relationship, and once they're in a relationship, the bar, it kind of goes way down for what they expect, or you could say it goes much higher for leaving, because leaving relationships is very costly. And if you're married, of course, much more costly, and not just, in a financial sense, which it may or may not be, but emotionally, as far as moving to a new home, you share a house or anything. So yeah, people seem to put up with a lot in committed relationships when they're cohabiting, when they're married. The more invested they are, and kind of that bar of satisfaction has to go way down for them to leave. Much more than it would be like if you asked them, like, hey, would you date this person right now? They might be thinking like, oh, I don't know. But like, would you leave the relationship? And it's kind of like, no, it's too much to leave. So yeah, the commitment in that sense, especially formal commitment through marriage, it can definitely keep people together a long time.
But then you mentioned at the beginning that women's drop off in relationship satisfaction seems to be greater than men's or faster than men's. What's going on there, do you think?
I don't really know, and I'm not sure anyone knows, but it's something that's pretty well observed that, if you follow women longitudinally, there was a really good representative study out of the UK that did this recently, and it looked at women, I think, over a 25-year period, all of these different age cohorts. And you see when, individuals get married in their late 20s or so, it's high. 5 years later, men's has dropped a little bit, women's has dropped low. And you look at after about 20 years down the line, and female relationship satisfaction is something like half of what it is for men. But it's interesting as well, because if you poll relationships at any given moment, marriages, I should say, if you look at this in like the GSS statistics, and it has an item that just asks for like marital happiness. It says like very satisfied, a little satisfied, unsatisfied. you have something like 90% of people at any given moment in marriage that say they are very satisfied. So it seems to be what happens is if you ask people kind of a binary, or I should say multiple choice kind of question like that, people are just like, I'm satisfied. If you ask them to rate it or you use a scale, maybe it goes down a little bit. And at any given moment, people don't seem to be super motivated to leave the relationship until they are. So it's kind of like everyone is happy until they're not, and then they don't last long and they're out.
Could it be that women are more neurotic and it means that they're more sensitive to feeling negatively about the relationship?
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a really good explanation for it. And one of the personality explanations for that, women score higher in neuroticism, and so what is that? Basically, emotionality. They're more emotional. They're more sensitive to things like that. So yeah, anything bad that occurs in the relationship, it can impact women more than it impacts men, and anything that is just neutral or not going good, perhaps will be perceived more negatively. And if things just are not going good over time, sure, that high neuroticism can kind of enhance the perception that that things are not well.
Um, can we talk about cheating as well? So, am I right that men and women cheat for different reasons generally? Right. So, men who cheat are more likely to actually be perfectly satisfied with their main relationship. It's just that they're looking for sexual variety. Whereas when women cheat, it's because they want out, right, and they're looking for an alternative.
Exactly. Yeah. That's very much, yeah, my perception of it. And I think generally what the research shows on it is men and women cheat for different reasons, at least on average. There's a lot of overlap. Men and women have affairs and they want to be with the affair partner and they love him. But yeah, if you look, for example, at one night stands, men are much more likely to cheat with a one night stand. Women, on the other hand, are much more likely than men to say that they're in love with their affair partner. So we have, this can kind of go back, to evolutionary psychology explanations for this, parental investment theory, that kind of a thing. So men don't have much of a burden, perhaps from that perspective, as far as cheating goes, right? And kind of the idea like I can maintain a relationship, I can have extra pair sex on the side. If someone becomes pregnant, perhaps there's less of a need to invest in that. Whereas women, on the other hand, are the ones becoming pregnant. So it's always kind of an investment for them who they select as a mate. So what do we see here is perhaps for men, there is a little bit more of a dual strategy. You can maintain a committed relationship and at the same time, you can seek extra pair sex. For women, it seems to be more like mate switching. When women have an affair, it's often the case that they're very unhappy in their relationship and they're in love with the new affair partner. And if they could, they would leave that relationship and be with the affair partner.
So women are treating it like a lifeboat.
Yeah. Mhm. And it's actually uncommon that people do actually end up with the affair partner, but that is often kind of the desire and the intent there. If that actually works out, often, for many reasons it doesn't, but that's usually kind of the desire there and the big difference in desire in that case. Another thing too, men are much more likely to pursue affairs with strangers. So you look at websites like Seeking Arrangements or something like that, exclusively men. If you look at Men Report, where did they find it? Often it can be just kind of a random person. For women, it's almost always like a friend, someone they work with, or even a friend of the husband or something like that. So you see in the case of women that these affairs often develop sort of accidentally by situational conditions. They meet someone who happens to be there and it kind of develops. For men, it's much more deliberate. Like, I am seeking out an affair.
And okay, and so for women, it's like you have an unhappiness in the main relationship, this other person comes along, and that combination can produce an affair. Whereas men are more likely to sort of go seeking sexual adventure.
Yeah, exactly. There has to be kind of some dissatisfaction there. Not always, of course, but very often, yeah. And that opportunity has to be present and all of that. And for women, opportunities very often are present, but yeah, men are much more likely to say, I'm going to go out and seek it.
I have noticed, but maybe this is anecdotal, and I'm thinking also of like famous celebrities, right? That men quite often have affairs with women who are actually not as good looking as their wives.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed also, and I'm not sure if there's any research on that, but it does seem to be the case. And I mean, that would be a good example of the effect of novelty, right? It's not necessarily like trading up, like she's not pretty or not attractive anymore or whatever, but just an effect of novelty. Like, I'm bored with her. I want someone else. This person is different. Or even just, this other person was there and available. So yeah, men are much less selective in that sense. It's interesting because, research kind of indicates men care a little bit more about physical attractiveness than women do, especially in these short-term pairings. But at the same time, the bar is kind of low for men for who they'll select as a sexual partner. Again, kind of goes back to parental investment theory. Men don't have to pay that much attention for investment, especially in short-term contexts.
Yeah, this is such a sort of a deep and important truth that is not, which I think it's one of the things that young women often don't know, how low the bar is for men for short-term pairings. Like the bar for being wife material is high, but something I wrote in my first book, and which I really wish every teenage girl knew, is like the fact that he wants to have sex with you does not mean that he loves you. It's amazing how many young women do not know that.
Yeah, and something we know as well is that women use sex to secure mates, long-term mates, and we see an association with attractiveness there, where women who are more attractive are a little bit less promiscuous than women who are kind of middle range attractive. So why might that be? Perhaps being middle range attractive requires a little bit more competition. And so what do women do? They have sex earlier to kind of secure that investment, which is kind of another thing related to hookups. I think a lot of men kind of project their own perspective and desire of hookups onto women, and they think, like everyone is promiscuous, they just want casual sex, which is kind of true for men. But for women, a lot of time, what gets reported as casual sex or these situationships or whatever, those are women that are kind of interested in a relationship with that person, but it just doesn't progress. And I have another interesting idea for you. Let me springboard off of that. We talk about short-term and long-term mating, but I think we also see a phenomenon where men will enter long-term relationships, but kind of with the foot half out of the door. They won't commit. So they will say, they'll be in a relationship, they'll have a girlfriend, but it's like, you want to get married? You want to get married? No. They know that they don't want to commit and be all in on that relationship, but they kind of keep it there anyway, still as a long-term relationship, but with a lower level of commitment.
Yes, I mean, there is no shortage of women on Reddit or wherever complaining about that. It seems to be a very widespread phenomenon. Yeah, it's really interesting you say that middling attractive women are more likely to be promiscuous. Um, I think that if that were, it's a kind of mystery to me, an interesting mystery as to why um, slut shaming still happens, kind of, but slut shaming is definitely less common now than in previous eras. And if anything, women being sexually adventurous and so on can be very high status. Even though, as you say, I mean, if anything is like objectively high status for women, it's being beautiful. And beautiful women are actually less likely to be. I mean, it just seems kind of odd that it has ever become established that being promiscuous is a high status thing to do among women, at least superficially. I think probably deep down there's still a lot of shame and slut shaming going on from other women. But it seems really perverse that sort of sex positivism would ever have become popular among women.
Yeah, it really does. And it's interesting because men and women both, and it's almost kind of the way that men perceive promiscuity in other men, because we know that male promiscuity is seen as a really robust status signal to other men. Women actually view it kind of negatively, a man who's promiscuous. In fact, they seem to view that about as negatively across the research as women view, or as men view promiscuity in women, which is,
Really? Yeah, I
which
didn't
is
know that.
pretty
Okay.
strong. So women, yeah, women view it negatively, but men don't. Men view it as really positive. And from the day that boys are like 13 years old, they'll be bragging about having sex. They've obviously never had sex as a 13-year-old. They'll just be making up stories on the playground. But now, kind of, we see this role reversal where it's kind of like now having a lot of sexual partners and sex for a woman is also kind of high status. And I wonder if that's related as well to the narrowing gap of what's called sexual double standards. We used to have that like promiscuity as a man, as a player, as a woman, it's a slut, and now we're seeing sexual double standards close, and so we're seeing kind of with the sexual revolution as well, kind of the endorsement of high promiscuity as high status or positive, both for men and women in that case.
Yeah, it's curious. I mean, it's still the case, though, isn't it, that promiscuous women suffer a penalty in terms of men's attitude towards them as long-term partners, right? Even if you'll have men who talk the talk on being very open-minded about all of this, but actually their preferences show, right, in terms of how they walk the walk.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you ask men and women, what is your ideal body count in a partner? It's really low. Interestingly, it doesn't usually seem to be zero, but it's going to be like two or three. So people report a relatively low past partner count. If you look at people's actual past partner counts, what they report in a partner, it correlates pretty closely with their own. So we know that more promiscuous people pick more promiscuous partners as long-term mates, which makes sense. So the people who say, I don't care very much or whatever, they probably do care a little bit less, and their actual mate selection seems to show that. But yeah, we know that as we can kind of debate as people do, like how important is it or whatever, but it's really rare that you see anything that would indicate like more promiscuous is better for women, right? You never see kind of the effect in the opposite direction. The effect's always in one direction, and it's just kind of a debate over the magnitude of like, is it a little bit important or is it a lot important?
Yeah, yeah. And also, I suppose the thing is, it's like, what trade-offs are you willing to carry, right? Like a super, super attractive woman who
Right.
has quite a high body count is obviously still going to be at an advantage, which is one of this kind of, again, going back to red pill myths, this idea that all the promiscuous party girls end up like tragic and alone. Like, no, they don't. They're gorgeous. They obviously, they obviously eventually get married and have kids and are fine, right?
Yeah, I've said that a lot, and that often makes people very angry. Obviously, it's a huge cope. It's kind of the sour grapes cope or something like that, right? Like these are people that did not pick me when I was young, when I was a young man, 1925 or whatever. But they're going to hit an age, and now no one's going to pick them. And it's like, no, no. If attractiveness is pretty stable over the lifetime. There's studies that look at yearbook pictures in high school, and the correlation ratings of the attractiveness of individuals in yearbooks and when they're like 60 years old is like zero point 0.7. So attractive people are young, they pretty much remain attractive. We talk about like a glow up. Doesn't seem to happen that much. Attractive people are attractive across their lifetime. And if someone's really attractive and promiscuous when they're young, they're going to be 35. They're not going to have any problem. They're probably going to be married or whatever the case may be. But yeah, it's kind of a very soothing cope, I guess, for people who have been rejected and a revenge fantasy in that sense. They want that revenge. I've been rejected, and now one day you too will be rejected.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that the ideal number of former partners is like low but not zero. I mean, post-sexual evolution, how many men do we find now who want a virgin for a wife? Which is, of course, traditionally what all men would want, but how many men would still say that they want that, do you know?
So that's interesting because I asked that on one of my surveys, and I don't remember the exact figure of how many men actually said that they wanted a virgin. It might have been 15 or 20%. I would say, we'll give it a range like 15 to 25%. But something that I did find was, who were the men that were more interested in virgins? There were men that were themselves much younger. That about 18 to 19 were the men that really said like zero a lot. And this was a pretty wide range of ages. The mean age and the median as well is about 30 in my sample. So it's a pretty strong belief, I think, from men like that, men that have had no past sexual partners themselves as well. So it's kind of like that strong preference for a virgin seems to be concentrated in men who are themselves very sexually inexperienced or virgins themselves, which I mean is kind of reasonable, right? Like, you're a young man and you've never had sex, and maybe you want a girlfriend who's the same as you. That's very assortative, and it's reasonable. It's not kind of like a man who's 35 and who's had 50 partners. He's like, I want a virgin, which is kind of like, bro, you're not going to find a 35-year-old virgin. But if you're 18 years old, I mean, it's pretty reasonable.
Is there, were you able to filter for religiosity as well? Because I'm guessing that
And
would also, okay.
I didn't check on that one. In fact, no, I don't think I looked at religion in any of the body count surveys.
I mean, because I was thinking that maybe one of the reasons why men might not want a virgin is if they are non-religious themselves and not conservative themselves, and they might take that as indicative of a woman being religious and conservative, and so see it as undesirable in
Yeah,
that
that
sense.
that might make sense. And I was also wondering, kind of related to that, if men who said they don't want a virgin are just kind of repeating or perhaps kind of implicitly rejecting the narrative, like I don't want someone who's too young, like an age gap, or if they're kind of implicitly rejecting the narrative coming from men who say that they do want a virgin, who very often, like exactly like you said, who seem religious, conservative, red pilled, or whatever, kind of being like, oh, I don't want to be that guy that says I want a virgin, in a sense.
Okay, age gaps. Do men and women desire the same kind of age gaps?
Sure. So something that's, I think, very robust in this age gap stuff. You can see it in published papers and the surveys I've run. You can see it in the, I think it was the OkCupid data set where people are like picking the actual age. Men overwhelmingly prefer women who are a little bit younger. It can often be substantially younger, and that increases with age. So men who are, say 22 or something, they're saying, okay, I want a woman who's like 19 or 20. Men who are 60 are like, I want a woman who's 40. So as men get older, the age gap increases. For women, the age gap consistently remains across the lifespan within like 2 to 4 years or so, with the men being slightly older. Women have a really high correlation with their own age. Across my surveys, it's been like 0.85, 0.95, like this extremely high correlation with their own age and the age of men they prefer. So those are the stated preferences, and also those are very consistent with actual mate choice, particularly for women in that case. David Buss did a very large survey on this where he looked at age gap preferences and also actual mate choice. And he said, okay, the average age gap preference is about 4 years, actual mate choice about 4 years. So yeah, these stated preferences, they coincide really strongly with the revealed preferences, at least for women, because like I said, older men, they do kind of indicate a preference for a younger woman there.
You've seen that Rupert Murdoch has just got married again to a woman. He's like in his 90s and he's got married to a woman who's in her late 50s, I think. But so he's like his age gaps are getting bigger as he gets older, but he's not marrying. Presumably he could marry a 21-year-old if he really wanted to, and he's not doing so. Um, so yes. So okay, so is it that women basically always want 2 to 4 years above however old they are, whereas men it's a bit more like it moves upwards, but maybe the range gets bigger as they get older. Is that it?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. The range is bigger. And it's really interesting, like you said, yeah, Rupert Murdoch is an example. So you don't see a lot of Leonardo DiCaprios, right? Who are like much older men selecting very young women. And there's even been interesting research on what's called a beauty status exchange, to like men who are higher in status or older or something like that. And they're able to get much younger women. Do they really do it that much? It's really, really infrequent that that happens. But you do see these age gaps as people get older that are like that, like a 60-year-old man with a 40-year-old woman or something like that. Those are much more common. And it is interesting, like you said, because conceivably he could find probably some 20-year-old woman, who would like his high status and wealth and all of that. But he didn't. He picked someone, in their 50s. So it does kind of show, this preference reflecting as well what men actually pick, even if they didn't have to pick that.
And Leonardo DiCaprio gets shamed for
Yeah.
his always dating a woman who's in her early 20s. What do you think's going on there? Why is he getting shamed? He's getting shamed by women, right? I don't think men are especially disapproving, or are they?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, he's getting shamed, and you see that a lot. And one of the explanations, that kind of made sense to me at first would be intersexual competition, and that's something that I kind of tested there, looking at different ranges of age, right? So if it's intersexual competition from older women, we should expect older women to disapprove more of age gaps, right? The idea, would be that old women perceive these, or older women, I should say, perceive these, and they're saying, ah, young women are stealing the man out of the mate pool. So that's kind of the, maybe the subconscious desire there. I didn't find that older women perceived them more negatively than younger women. Young women, women across the three age ranges, they all perceived these large age gaps pretty negatively, and the most negatively when the woman was very, very young. So rather than that, it could be that a lot of young women simply have the experience of um, perhaps an older man hitting on them or something that they don't like, right? I think everyone has experienced that kind of at some point, and maybe they project that because women who have been in an age gap relationship, they're much, much more likely to approve of it. They're much more likely to see these things positively. So it's kind of the women without experience of a positive age gap relationship that view them more negatively. Whereas I think most women, young women have had the experience of being like harassed by a creepy older dude or getting hit on. And I really think maybe that just shapes experiences, but I don't know for sure.
That's interesting. Do we know if there are okay, because there is a little bit of a stereotype of the woman who's really into older men. I sometimes call them daddy chasers. Like, there's sometimes a kind of unstable personality thing going on there. Does that stereotype map onto reality? I'm not talking about 5 years here and there, but like women who are really into much older men from a young age seem to be quite a distinct phenomenon.
I don't really know, actually, and there's been so little research on age gaps, I couldn't really give an informed opinion on it. That's certainly, the popular perception there. And you have to wonder, if you see people deviate in their sexual preferences or their behavior or whatever from the norm in such an extreme way, you do kind of have to wonder, like, why? Why are they like that? What made them different, and how are they different? That sort of thing. I would consider, or wonder, I guess, about women doing that, kind of like, do they conform? Are they very interested in resources, right? But in this case, perhaps it's not a resource thing. They're women, we're talking about, who genuinely like the way that older men look. They're into kind of the gray hair or whatever the case may be. But I have no idea what's going on there. I could only guess.
Maybe okay, because this goes back to this thing, which maybe we should go do some 101 for people who aren't familiar with, like what do men and women find attractive in one another? um, should we do that and then think about how that might become dysfunctional? Because right, so like men obviously do find youth attractive. Women do find wealth and other status attractive, but it's like it's a difference, but it's not that massive. Like, and there's a tendency, I think, to exaggerate this to some extent. I mean, like, I'm just look at people I know, like actually high earning men. They're not dating 20-year-old supermodels. Like, they actually have women who are also, their wives are also highly educated, slightly younger than them. Like, anyway, talk about the differences, and then we can talk about how big they really are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's related kind of to the beauty and status exchange kind of research. The idea that, do high status men really pursue much younger women and all of that? Interestingly, we looked down the list of the Forbes top 50 billionaires to look at their relationships, their first relationships, and then their second relationships. Did they get divorced? Was there evidences of affairs or anything like that? For affairs, obviously, not all of the information is necessarily going to be there. But what did we find? That they were much more likely to marry women close to their own age, stay married a very long time. They have kids on average, that are more kids on average, I should say. They didn't seem to have more affairs than the general population. So these are, the top 50 billionaires. And then additionally, if they got divorced or remarried, it was often with a woman who had a substantial age gap. I think it was about 10 years on average. But at that point, I'm not sure that that's that different from men at a much higher age remarrying, because kind of like what we described before, yeah, it's not uncommon for men who are 50 to marry someone who's 40 or who's 55 or all of that. So it doesn't seem to be the case that high status men are kind of exploiting their high status to secure really, really young mates or anything like that. Like you said, it seems to be very assortative. Often they're picking, and we looked at this a little bit, but I didn't record it in the data. Often they are picking wives who come from an affluent status themselves. They're people that they're meeting in real life. They're running in those same circles. So that seems to be the case. Yeah, they're not just chasing young supermodels.
Yeah, and similarly, like women like status and wealth and stuff, obviously, but also women. It's not like women like ugliness, right? Like, I mean, you read Mills and Boon or any of this kind of like erotic fantasy stuff directed at women, and the men are always really good looking. It's more, I think, that are willing to trade off a bit of looks for the sake of status and so on, and they're like the balance is a little bit different than it is for men.
Yeah, if they are, it's very small, and I think that certainly exists because we know that women prioritize resources and status kind of more than men do. But I think it's pretty small at the end of the day. And certainly, research using speed dating methodology, like who gets picked on a speed date, that sort of thing. Signs of affluence or wealth or status, they seem to do very little. What's the best predictor there? Attractiveness typically emerges number one. Personality, a pretty close second. Different personality variables. So, I've always kind of got the impression that those things help, and especially for maintaining a long-term relationship, some sort of stability there. But at the end of the day, an attractive person is going to get picked, maybe within their own socioeconomic status or whatever. But you never really seem to see, very high status men or whatever the case may be, like going into the poorest neighborhood and dating like the barista or something like that. Just doesn't seem to really be happening quite like that.
Yeah, yeah, right. Like, you'd expect all these, tech billionaires or whatever to have like a gorgeous wife from the ghetto, and that's not happening. Like, they also marry Ivy League grads who often like are good looking but not supermodels or whatever. Yeah, like the power of assortative mating seems to be more powerful than the sort of sex differential.
Yeah, definitely. And if you think of high status individuals, often they tend to be kind of intelligent. They tend to be planners a little bit and that sort of a thing. I can't imagine them maintaining just a highly dysfunctional relationship, with someone who perhaps comes from a background with a lot of dysfunction. And it seems like they would just next out of that very, very quick. Obviously, they're not in the environment to put them into contact with people like that, but they could seek them out, and they don't seem to. It seems to be that, at the end of the day, particularly for long-term mating, people do select people that they can have a relationship with.
And I think maybe that's the reason why Leonardo DiCaprio is frowned upon a bit and daddy chasers are frowned upon a bit. It's because I guess everyone sort of knows that, yeah, men like looks and women like status, but it's gauche to point it out, and it's gauche to sort of prioritize that over everything else. Like, the thing that seems a bit sus about Leonardo DiCaprio's behavior is it makes you think that he doesn't really care about talking to his girlfriends. He doesn't really care about any kind of personality stuff. He just cares primarily about youthful beauty. And that I guess, sets off alarm bells because you think, is that really a functional way of pursuing relationships to care about something that's so transient?
Right. Yeah, I agree. That's something that people often mention with these large age gaps is they say, what could they possibly talk about? What could they possibly have in common? And when someone is that young, people talk about it kind of like, are they exploitative or manipulative? Is someone, who's 19 able to kind of make that choice? And then I think men also see kind of the flip side of it and they think like, oh, this woman is a gold digger. She's taking advantage of him. So it's almost like a mutually exploitative relationship in that sense, I think. And because it is so extreme, it's such an extreme kind of example of those stereotypes, like woman wants a rich guy, guy wants like a 19-year-old. I think it just ticks all of the buttons, right, for getting people kind of riled up about it. But yeah, it doesn't look great, I guess.
Let's talk about masculinity. Well, I know what's attractive about polarity, right? Because I think I've heard already say that women they like masculinity in men. They like height, broad shoulders, all this kind of stuff, but not too much. Like there's a point where, like the Giga Chad, the model who's so often used as a meme, is actually not sexy. He's too masculine. He like pushes it too far. What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Certainly. So the Giga Chad, yeah, we put his face up and just did a little survey and had men and women rate him, and men, of course, rated him much more attractive than women did. And this is kind of consistent with research on facial attractiveness across the board. That the most dimorphic or the most masculine male faces are usually not rated the most attractive. Usually it's kind of a middle range face. And so one reason that could be is because more masculine faces might just signal high aggression or threat or even the ability to impose physical harm. We know, for example, that there are pretty good correlations with facial structure and fighting ability. So like, big head, big brows, you're going to be a big guy and be able to throw punches and take punches. So it could signal like, okay, this is someone that could hurt me physically. And women have kind of always had that trade-off in mate selection, kind of from that ancestral point of view. Like, okay, I want a man who's physically able and capable of protecting me, but at the same time, I don't want a man who's going to hurt me, right? So they kind of want, I think, what Jeffrey Miller, I think he called the Tinder defender in that case, someone who's capable of doing it. So there's kind of a trade-off in perhaps signals that signal high levels of aggression or even masculinity. Like, okay, we want someone that has these traits, but maybe not too much. Another could just be that extreme traits are not well associated with higher genetic fitness. So, if you see something kind of on the extremes, then maybe that's not the most attractive thing because it signals perhaps lower fitness or higher mutational load or something like that.
Right. So it indicates that someone might not actually be very healthy if they're weird, like say super tall or something like that. There might be something pathological going on.
Yeah, exactly. And even, the most tall individuals are not the most attractive. You have men that are above 6 feet rated attractive, but you start getting super, super tall men, then you see the curve go down. And it's like, whoa, that's too tall. So anything on the extremes seems to really be unattractive to women and to men in that case.
Does that happen with women being hyper feminine as well? Is there a point? Is there like a sweet spot for femininity where you're like 8 or 9 out of 10, but not 10 out of 10?
I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think so. I think as far as facial femininity, I think that's a closer linear relationship with attractiveness. It doesn't seem to be the case that men want a face that's not especially feminine. But as far as behavioral ratings, and we did a survey on this as well, men who perceive themselves as more masculine, they prefer women who are more feminine. And women who perceive themselves as more feminine prefer men who are more masculine. So there are probably as well an interaction between the kind of traits an individual has and the kind of traits that they prefer in a partner. And I wouldn't be surprised if that plays out physically as well. That women who are more physically feminine, who have more signs of femininity, also prefer men who have more signs of kind of masculinity in that case.
Why is that, do you think, that more masculine people are attracted to more feminine people? Is it kind of assortative in a funny way that it's people who are gender conforming prefer gender conforming partners?
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I kind of wondered that as well, if it was just kind of that desire for a gender conforming thing. I think men who like kind of those traditional roles might try to make themselves more masculine. They might try to lift or whatever the case may be, adopt kind of that image, and they might prefer women who are more feminine. They kind of just like those images in general. And yeah, Individuals who are less gender conforming, certainly I think we see this. I think this is an effect that we can just observe looking around. You see individuals who are very non-conforming. You very often see them, in relationships with people who are. So it's probably one of those things, yeah, that people are selecting for signs of similarity in that sense, even though, you would think like high masculinity, high femininity, not similar, but perhaps ideologically or as far as beliefs or that sort of thing they are.
Interesting. My husband actually is my husband's very like physically masculine and I'm very physically feminine. And we didn't realize until we had a child together, and our child looks exactly like both of us. And everyone goes around saying like, "Oh, he looks exactly like you, he looks exactly like you." That we just look really similar. But we didn't realize that we looked really similar because being masculine and feminine kind of obscures that. But clearly actually we are, which is another assortative thing, right? That people are attracted to people who look like them. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.